Emma. Our next presenter is Emma Greenwood, who's presenting a thesis project called The Isolated One. She worked on this with Dr. Andreessen. Emma has a number of graduates, and I'll be sitting in the front trying to get to the exact right spot, and I apologize in advance if there's any hiccups, but without further ado, I'd love to turn things over to Emma.
So my name is Emma, and I'm going to be doing my honors thesis presentation on the isolated ones, representation and criminality within the LGBTQ+ community. So I want to start off by displaying my research question, which, as y'all can see, is dealing with a lot of different academic things that I'm interested in. It deals with sociology, criminal justice, a little bit of political science, and then some personal interests with representation in the media. The reason why this topic matters so much right now is because it's very timely. There's a lot of legislation and bills in place like Don't Say Gay bills, as well as the banning of books with certain materials in them. And so I think this is a really important topic to be discussing at this moment. I want to begin with a synopsis of my literature and how I got to my endpoint. So I began my research looking at isolation theories of sociology, which led me to the different environments in which queer people are feeling most isolated. My main conclusion with that was in the household and in the school environment. So I decided to look at my research in terms of the school-to-prison pipeline, since the school is some of the first places where they come in contact with the criminal justice system. And then this also led me to the disproportionality of queer people and queer youths in the juvenile justice system. To give y'all a little statistic to see how big this disparity is, according to the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition, 13 to 15% of youths that come in contact with the juvenile justice system are LGBTQ+. And that's about 300,000 LGBT youths that are either detained or arrested each year. To put that into perspective, they only make up 5 to 7% of the youth population. So there's so many disparities with this, especially when you look intersectionally. So, looking at the school and home environment, I also collected data, or looked at data in the NCSC and Trevor project. If you haven't heard of NCSC, it is basically a national survey that takes place every other year, looking at the experiences of queer kids in schools. They cover all these topics on my left, and I looked from 2001 to 2021. As you can see, these are so many issues that they face, and the main conclusion that they had almost every single year was that non-inclusive curriculum leads to a negative impact in the areas of biased language, harassment, less access to resources, less reporting and intervention, less representation, and depending on the region you live in, it can be even worse. Looking at Trevor Project data from 2019 to 2022, you can see all of these different areas that they looked at, and something really important that I took out of it was 2022 was the first year they ever even mentioned representation as a positive impact on these kids. So it's not being talked about as much as it should be, and this media representation isn't social media, because that can have negative and positive. This is talking about traditional media through film and TV, seeing queer people live positive lives. So that brings me to my data collection. I wanted to begin with a little synopsis of the background on queer film and TV. If y'all haven't heard of the Hollywood Hays Code that began in 1934, this was a ban on some taboo topics discussed like homosexuality, and led to the beginning of gay coding, which is something that directors used to have queer people in film without explicitly naming them as queer characters, not giving them queer relationships. After the Hollywood Hays Code ended, there was some progress in the 1970s through some shows you may know called All in the Family. They had an episode where the bigoted father found out one of his friends was gay, and the whole episode was about it. There was another show called That Certain Summer in 1972 with one of the first sympathetic portrayals of a gay character. And fast forward 20 years later, there's something called the new queer cinema, which is something we see today. It's that complex, interesting queer character that we see. And this is something that I want to focus on because that's something that these youths are being influenced by now. There's also advocacy through film, often seen in documentaries, that has been introduced. And the last thing I wanted to talk about in this slide was, although there's been a lot of progress for queer media, there hasn't been as much intersectionally, especially with race, and you'll see that throughout the rest of my presentation. So I want to begin with how I collected my data. I watched 30 films and researched and watched 30 TV shows, so I've been very busy this year. And I did from 1990 to present day, and that's because of the new queer cinema. I used these 4 types of categories to analyze my data through, and I'm going to go through them right now. So, beginning with my first results section. The first thing I pulled out was that it was a lot easier for me to find queer films from the 90s than queer television shows. There weren't as many relevant queer people shown in TV. As well as with the genres, they were pretty similar with a couple variations like sitcoms and sci-fis and TV, and then a biography, a western, a crime thriller I saw in film. But one thing I really wanted to name was, although more than half of the directors were queer, there still needs to be a lot of progress in them. Because I myself especially love to see something shown by someone in the community that truly understands it, and I feel like it produces better art. As well as with the different networks in which a television show is produced, this makes a huge difference. So you may know the network Showtime with shows like The L Word, Queer as Folk, Shameless. If any of you have seen those, they're a lot more risque and have more explicit content than shows produced on ABC Family, which can be a lot more family-oriented. And also, streaming platforms produce 8 out of 30 of the TV shows, which is a new form of access for these youths that's continually progressing. So this is a little collage I made of all of the queer characters in film, and as you can see, it's great to see so much representation, but it's really lacking in diversity. Same for the collage I made with all of the TV characters. I tried to get some relationships in there that were really monumental as well. Now, into my second section of results, I looked at the types of characters, if they were perfect or imperfect, their relationship statuses, and the presence of coming out storylines. In terms of the type of characters, I saw so much more diversity within the alphabet of LGBTQ+ when it came to television. It was really hard to find some diversity in film. And in terms of perfect versus imperfect, this is dealing with if they had issues or struggles outside of just their sexuality. Queer people are often put into a box and only really shown as having issues because they're queer. And so I found a lot more perfect stereotypes in the television than film. And in terms of relationships, they really varied. I saw some really raw, realistic showings of queer love, which I think is great for youths to see. But I also saw some by people you could tell have never really experienced it. And lastly, with the coming out storylines, I often expected this when I watched a queer film or TV show to see this scene, and when I didn't see it, it was kind of refreshing. I feel like coming out storylines can be kind of characterized as something where you're being validated by heterosexual people, you're not just living a queer life. So in terms of my first video I'm showing, this was something that was super important to me as a kid in particular. I know this scene was especially moving to me. And yeah, you can take a second to play it, but.
Hey. It's complicated. Is it Tara? You mean Tara has a crush on us? No. Huh?
Yeah, so that scene, honestly, I think the face that Buffy showed was pretty, something a lot of queer people can relate to, seeing that face on their friend whenever they come out to them. Although this ended really positively, very accepting, I think the scene just really shows a realistic portrayal. And in the next scene I'm showing, it's a pretty different vibe. I don't know if you consider it a traditional coming out scene, but it's showing the portrayal of a young boy coming out to a father figure, really exploring his sexuality and to someone that he thinks may not understand and may not be educated on it. But yeah, I think this is a really important scene, but I also want to say there's some harsh language, so just trigger warning. Yeah, I think this scene is super important for kids to see that you can come to an adult and ask questions and it be answered honestly and just having that open dialogue. Awesome. So for my results in the third section, I looked at different tropes seen in film and TV. This includes parody stereotyping, which is whenever you use queer stereotypes and really exacerbate them for comedic purposes. Deviant behavior, which has changed over time. It used to be viewed in a psychology law way, very negative, and now I looked at it in more deviant behavior, like adultery or substance use or violence. Then gay coding, as I explained earlier, and then the tragic ending trope as well. So this can either be through the death of a queer character or the cancellation of a TV show as well. As you can see in TV, this was used far more often. I think just the availability of time to be able to explore these, but they can also be negative and positive. So I have some examples of these. This is one from a film that I think is honestly kind of a positive portrayal. It's using it comedically to kind of show the ridiculousness of heterosexual portrayals of flamboyancy in gay men. And yeah, feel free to play the clip if you're able. Yeah, so as you can see, it's like parody, but also very comedic, and I think positive, and I like. And then the next one I'm showing is kind of from the other version, it's lesbian stereotyping through this film. So as you can see, it's very stereotypical, but I think all done in like fun and comedic purposes. Do you want to click the next one? So in my last results section, I looked at some more serious topics like activism, sexualization, intersectionality, and like casting processes. And as you can see, they explored so many types of activism within the LGBTQ+ community. I think this is super important for youths to see this, but I also like how they do some things in a more positive light. One thing I also want to talk about was intersectionality. It's really lacking. It's better on television than it is in film, but it can always be progressed. And the last thing is sexualization in film and TV really differs, but one main difference I saw was between gay sexualization and lesbian sexualization. With gay sexualization, it was often used for comedic purposes, while lesbians were just seen very sexually. And I think this has to do with society viewing women and women's bodies in a specific way, and also invalidation of lesbians in general. And I have one final clip that is showing activism in the AIDS crisis. And within this activism, there's also allyship, which I think is super important. You know, queer issues aren't just for queer people. They're also for everyone to care about. And this is a really good example of that from the film Philadelphia.
Spanish, is it true that you worked for Walsh somewhere around 4 years ago at the same time as Walton?
That's right.
And at that time, did Walton know the AIDS lesions on your face and arms were like?
Definitely. I saw all the photos.
Not Walton treated you.
Every time you come in contact
So as you can see, he was on trial because his law firm fired him because he had AIDS, and that woman was really just trying to prove it's everyone's issue, not just gay people's issue. And just to conclude my thesis presentation, I want to talk about some conclusions I had from my research. I truly do believe that increased positive media representation in traditional media will decrease feelings of isolation. It gives a sense of belonging, a sense of community when they don't have that in the home or the school environment, which in turn leads to less criminality. As well, in terms of inclusive curriculum, it's really important for us to also include this. You can include documentaries, activist films in your history classes, include books with queer characters in your English classes. All of this is really inclusive. And the last thing I want to say is we have the power to vote, and these kids don't, and they're being impacted by this legislation, and we have the power to stop it. So I really would appreciate if everyone would vote for legislators that care about queer kids. Thank you.
I'm curious how this changed how you view media now and the process of watching so many things and analyzing them deeply. And if you could pick a piece of media that you would recommend that would present a positive light, either in classrooms or in the home, what it would be?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think ever since this, I have been deeply analyzing film better, I think before I've been kind of just a passenger along the ride. Now I really feel like I'm in it and it's important. If I had to choose one, especially that I watched, honestly the film Philadelphia could be used in so many different classrooms. I think it teaches a lot of different things. It teaches things about law, inclusiveness, allyship, and just a lot of different things. There's also some documentaries I wasn't able to watch that I would highly recommend. If anyone wants a documentary recommendation, let me know because I have a lot. But yeah, I think mainly those.
Other questions for Emma?
Yes.
Do you think that in general, for the films you watched, did you find the portrayals more powerful when they did focus on queer identity and on that person's identity, or did you find it more powerful when it was just one other aspect of their character, or do you think we need some of both out there?
Yeah, I think both is really important, but I think whenever they would have films without that coming out storyline, but about someone just forming in themselves and exploring within themselves, that was super impactful. I know for me, I grew up in a really accepting environment, and coming out was something I really had to do in certain areas, but I think my own self-exploration was the hardest part, and so I think there needs to be more film with that, especially with different identities, intersectional things. I watched great films like the film Pariah, I don't know if anyone's watched, but it's super, super good, and it's really intersectional and just deals with so many different issues. But yeah, it definitely focused on that too.
This was very good. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah.
Do you feel that the change with the political spectrum in today's world, that the more education we can get out there, that young people need to vote and will move forward to move this spectrum the other direction?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a huge thing. And when I was researching with the Trevor Project and NCSC, just in schools in general, there were some schools with super inclusive educational things, including textbooks and history, and that changed everything with just kids feeling like they could go to teachers and ask questions. They could stay after school and talk about these things, the inclusion of GSA clubs, all of that just increased extremely. And I think outside of the school environment, if we did the same thing, it would have huge impacts. I think people should never stop learning, and you should always strive to educate yourself on things. And I think that would be super, super impactful, for sure.
And have you thought about going and testifying at the legislature and sharing, especially I think some of the data, the literature-rooted data that you showed at the beginning, highlighting the direct connection between representation in schools and some of the outcomes for students? Is that something that you would consider?
Yeah, so my advisor and I actually talked a little bit, because I know he testified with a little bit different topic, but yeah, I thought it would be super interesting. I think that this data is out there and able to see, so people really should be looking into it. But yeah, I would be interested.
And speaking of your your advisor, I'd like to invite Dr. Andreessen up to give you your cord and stole to say a few words. Okay,
I just found out about this part of the presentation before the presentation. So, do you mind putting it over? Because I'm just
Yes.
sort of, yeah, but I don't mind talking.
Yes,
Yeah.
you just say what a great advice you have.
Thanks, somebody heard that. The mental labor that, oh. Thank you, thanks for the mic. So this is a fantastic project, and I'm so, I'm so blown away with it. And even coming up here, I mean, that line about excluding the coming out story, I mean, that's fantastic. So I'm older, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and nowhere in these teenage films did you ever have like a heterosexual coming out. That's just something you didn't have to do. And in that part where you're sort of, where you talked about just sort of asking somebody's permission to accept you. I'm so glad you brought that in there because that's not something you should have to do. That's not something, anybody should have to do. So I think media is going to be the real key to trying to survive. We're in for about 10, 15 years maybe of some really hard times. They can sort of control the schools, they can defund the schools, but people love movies and they love television, and I think, this work is really going to be on the forefront, and I'm not kidding, I mean, you could really do a lot with it. I'm reading an article right now, I'd rather be reading your stuff, about representation and how and how that matters, and so I'm really excited about this work, and I hope you stay in touch with us, and I hope, if you need help or guidance, feel free to come back and talk to us, because, I mean, this work could be what keeps a young person in a small town in Missouri alive, So that, I mean, I just say this and don't wrap it up with talking too much. But I talked to a man in his 60s, I did this presentation, and he told me what it's like to grow up in, I think it was Missouri or Kansas, and to be gay in the 70s. And he said, I went to the library, that's the only place I could find. I was so terrified that people wouldn't understand what was going on, or that they would figure it out because I had the library. They don't have that anymore. So this media is going to be really, really important. So thanks again.
Your stole and this cord represent the success not only of this project, but of 4 years of hard work and contribution to our honors program. So please rise and repeat high. Thank you.